Ask any American Iraq War veteran which place he really doesn't want to talk about, and a lot of them will give you the same name: Fallujah. The horrors that happened there throughout 2004 are simply beyond what a healthy mind can comprehend. Most of it was never shown in the news, and now when you hear it, you'll understand why. So let's start from the beginning, with what slowly but surely led up to all of this. After the invasion of Iraq to remove the dictator Saddam Hussein on the grounds that they had weapons of mass destruction, which by the way turned out to not really be true, the war turned into a long, ugly insurgency that engulfed the country. And one city in particular would see the worst of it. That city is Fallujah, some 30 miles west of Baghdad. The city is dense, with about 50,000 buildings in just 15 square miles, mostly 1- and 2-story with flat roofs and walled compounds. Fallujah was also a much more religious city than other places. It was known as the City of Mosques, with over 200 of them in the city and surrounding villages. Now, you need to understand this so the horrors that are about to come land even harder for you. So listen to this carefully for a moment. Iraq's population was mostly Sunni and Shia, which are the two main branches of Islam, and these two had quite bad blood between them throughout history. Now, for over 20 years, the country was ruled by Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party, and being a member of this party gave you an entry ticket to any serious career in Iraq, and without it, good luck finding a job. And although Iraq was majority Shia, Saddam himself was Sunni, so his senior officers, intelligence services, secret police, and so on were drawn largely from cities like Fallujah, which was overwhelmingly Sunni, and they were all directly on Saddam's payroll. On top of that, Fallujah was tribally proud and hostile to outside authority, and they wouldn't have it any other way. So when the American invasion rolled in during March 2003 and Saddam's regime collapsed within a few weeks, two things happened that would seal the fate of Fallujah and everyone in it. The first was that the entire Iraqi army and Saddam's party were dissolved, which meant that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi men lost their salaries. But they kept their weapons and training. You see where I'm going? Now, the second thing was the new order from the Americans that gave power to the Shia majority that had been ground down for decades by Saddam's regime. And for Fallujah's Sunnis, this didn't look like liberation, but like a real chance for Shia to take revenge for everything that happened in the years before that. However, despite the ticking bomb that Fallujah was, at first there wasn't any trouble, and it was actually quieter than most of Iraq. But the fuse was there, and someone just had to light it. So, a few weeks after the fall of Baghdad, American airborne infantry moved to Fallujah and occupied the school in the city center, which became a problem as the locals wanted classes to resume. On the night of April 28, 2003, a few hundred Fallujahs marched towards the school in protest, demanding the soldiers leave it. But as they approached the school, the American troops opened fire, killing 17 Iraqis and wounding 70 more. American soldiers said they received fire from the crowd, although no evidence of it was ever found. And the Fallujahs said the Americans opened fire without provocation on unarmed civilians. 2 days later, another protest formed, now even bigger, and they went to the American battalion headquarters and threw shoes and stones at the soldiers. Guess what happened again? Americans opened fire, killing and wounding more Iraqis, so in the evening the Fallujahs retaliated with a grenade attack on American headquarters, wounding 7 soldiers. The first American casualties in Fallujah, but definitely not the last. The fuse was now lit. Insurgent troops began to organize and attack the Iraqi police and American convoys. So one thing led to another, and the situation was slowly but surely spiraling out of control. In March 2004, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, with the 1st Marine Division under Major General James Mattis, specifically took over the job in Fallujah. Within hours of the handover on March 24th, the Marines were already in running-gun battles with insurgents. By the last days of March, every American in the area knew that Fallujah was about to blow. It blew on the morning of March 31st, 2004. 4 American private security contractors employed by the company Blackwater USA were driving through Fallujah in 2 unarmored cars. Their job that day was to escort a convoy carrying some equipment. These guys were almost all former US Special Operations veterans who now worked in private military companies, and armed convoy escorts were mostly what they did. But that day they were driving into one of the most hostile cities in the country, and they got ambushed. Insurgents opened up with AK-47s at close range, and the contractors were dead within seconds. They didn't stand a chance. The angry crowd then pulled their bodies out and did some things to them that we can't really talk about here on YouTube. They eventually hung 2 corpses on the King Faisal Bridge and posted a handwritten sign in English reading, "Fallujah is the graveyard of Americans." The incident ran on every news outlet around the world, and the Americans now had to do something. Very quickly, a full-scale assault on Fallujah was discussed, but the Marines on the ground had been in country for less than a month, and they simply didn't know the terrain or the enemy, or even have time to plan a proper operation. But they were overruled, and within 4 days they had their orders. This led them into what became known as the First Battle of Fallujah, codenamed Operation Vigilant Resolve, which kicked off on April 4th, 2004. The plan was for the 1st Marine Division's Regimental Combat Team 1 to seal off the city and push into it from the north and the south. But they entered a city they didn't know, in much smaller numbers and without the reinforcements they had asked for. The insurgents inside the city were a mixed bag, made up of former Saddam loyalists, local tribal fighters, and religious extremists who had begun to flow in from outside Iraq. And they engaged the American troops from inside houses and from rooftops, while the Marines responded with close-quarters infantry combat backed up by AC-130 gunship strikes. Within about a week, the Marines had taken roughly a third of the city, while creating quite a lot of media controversy, as Iraqi civilians caught in the crossfire were dying by the hundreds. The fighting was inside a heavily crowded city, and there were just horrible civilian casualties all around, caused by both sides. So just 6 days into the battle, the Marines were ordered to halt their offensive operations, and they stayed in their forward positions until the operation formally ended. 39 Americans had been killed and 90 wounded, roughly 200 insurgents and God knows how many civilians. Marines were then replaced by a hastily assembled local Iraqi unit made up of mostly Saddam's old army. Americans armed this new unit with a few hundred AKs, heavy machine guns, and RPGs, and then drove out of the city. And guess what happened? They sided with the insurgents they were supposed to fight against. For the 7 months between the end of the first Battle of Fallujah in May and the start of the second one in November, Fallujah was, in practical terms, an independent jihadist statelet inside Iraq. The Americans stayed outside the city, which filled up with a coalition of armed groups. The largest and most violent of them was the network around a guy named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. This man spent time in Afghanistan training in al-Qaeda camps, then brought a bunch of fighters with him into Iraq before the US invasion. His group would take the horrors about to happen in Fallujah to another dimension entirely. The group would become known for massive bomb attacks against Shia civilians and videotaping the things that they did to about 200 foreign hostages and putting those out into the world. In short, these guys became Al-Qaeda in Iraq and would later evolve into groups like ISIS or ISIL that terrorized Iraq and Syria for years. But now they were gathering, arming, and organizing themselves inside Fallujah, with fighters coming from everywhere in the world where Muslim extremists were found. And these were mostly veterans of previous wars around the world, like Chechen Muslim fighters, and they knew how to fight inside a city. Plus, they had the natives who knew the city they were going to fight in. They took control of the city, where they ruled in a brutal, strict way with a bunch of ridiculous laws that you, believe me, wouldn't want to break. Fallujah became the operational headquarters of the entire Iraqi insurgency. It was turned into a defense system specifically designed to bleed an American assault, with 3 defensive rings and hundreds of prepared fighting positions. Buildings were connected by tunnels and so-called mouse holes, through which the insurgents could move without ever exposing themselves in the open. Sniper positions, spider holes, booby traps, IEDs, everything was ready to make the Americans pay a horrible price if they ever decided to come into Fallujah. And now it was decided that they're going in. Because it became impossible to ignore what was happening in Fallujah, the decision was made to bring it back into government hands, without calling off the operation halfway like they did last time. So the preparations began in October 2004. Leaflets were airdropped into Fallujah and broadcasts went out telling civilians to leave the city before the assault, and the city was soon surrounded and sealed off. American and Iraqi forces set up checkpoints and decided who could get out of the city and who could not. It's estimated that up to 90% of the pre-war population fled the city, leaving everything they had behind. But not everyone could leave. Some people didn't have anywhere to go, or didn't have any money, and some chose not to separate from their families. You see, pretty much no military-aged males were allowed to leave Fallujah. They knew that the insurgents would slip out disguised as civilians, and because of that, a lot of the civilians stayed inside the city. By the time the cordon sealed, somewhere between 30 and 90,000 civilians was still inside. As for the plan itself, the attacking force was about 13,500 American and British troops with around 2,000 Iraqi soldiers attached. They spent weeks deceiving the insurgents into believing the attack would come from the south, building a fake forward base there. But the actual attack would come from the north. Marines and soldiers had been told that anyone who remained in Fallujah past this point would be considered a fighter, and the strict rules of engagement were now lifted. The bombardment began on the night of November 7th with around 2,500 high-explosive 155mm artillery shells fired in the opening salvo alone, plus the AC-130 and F-18 airstrikes. Soon, the entire electrical grid of Fallujah had been cut, while the bombardment was hammering targets to the north. The first ground action of the operation happened in the west. Task Force Wolfpack swept into the western peninsula of Fallujah to capture the General Hospital. During the first Battle of Fallujah, the city's hospital had helped bring down the operation politically, with graphic scenes from it airing around the world. That's why they didn't want this to happen again, or to let the insurgents use propaganda to their advantage. The hospital was quickly secured by American and Iraqi forces. Then the main attack came from the north 24 hours later. Tanks and fighting vehicles rolled in. The first major objective was the train station, and because the deception worked, it fell quickly and was set up as a forward command post. Once the train station was secured, the entire weight of the operation would go south through the heart of Fallujah. That was the plan, at least. The reality very quickly became something else. The first thing that attacking troops learned very quickly was that streets in Fallujah were death. Those houses that looked normal from the outside were, like I said earlier, prepared kill zones from the inside. Insurgents could move without ever going out into the streets and could fire from all angles on the advancing troops. Doorways were booby-trapped and stairwells bricked up to funnel soldiers into traps. There were whole rooms packed with propane gas cylinders or gasoline drums rigged to explode if anyone went inside. The booby traps were simply everywhere and in every shape and form you could and couldn't imagine. Everything was booby-trapped, even the dead bodies, and dead bodies were not always dead bodies. They were sometimes still alive, and just pretending to be dead to get the attacking soldiers to come close to them. Within a few days, the assault force started treating every dead body as if it was still alive, so they fired a few more rounds just in case and didn't come close to them. But the traps weren't the main thing the soldiers were afraid of. The real horror was the insurgents. American troops started experiencing something strange. The insurgents were charging at them, somehow taking multiple center mass shots without dropping. Soldiers soon started aiming for the head, because those insurgents had been on all sorts of substances that I can't even mention here without getting the video taken down from YouTube. American troops found quite a lot of evidence of that practice inside Fallujah, if you know what I mean. Now, those fighters were pretty much divided into two groups, based on, let's say, their personalities. Some of them would fire from a position, then pull back through a tunnel to reappear somewhere else and fire again. Others were men who intended to die and stayed in their fighting positions, alone or in small groups, trying to kill as many Americans as possible before they died. The standard tactic of kicking in front doors got abandoned within days. Marines started blasting holes in exterior walls with satchel charges or with tank cannons, and going in from there. And you can only imagine how many times there was an innocent family inside those houses that had nothing to do with the insurgents. Horribly too often. And now, because the insurgents were in well-protected positions that weren't taken out by the conventional artillery, Americans began firing white phosphorus shells. The WP would drive the insurgents out, and they'd finish them off with the standard high-explosive rounds. The technique worked and was used heavily in the first 10 days, but white phosphorus is an incendiary weapon, and its use against people isn't really a thing in modern warfare. It is not directly banned because it could be used through a loophole under the excuse of, quote, special smoke screen. That way, its horrifying incendiary and toxic effects, which affected mostly civilians by the way, were not originally intended. The smoke was what they wanted, and this was just an unfortunate accidental byproduct of it. This turned out to be a legal fight a year later, but you know how it goes with every war. The assault force kept pushing south, and the fighting was just horrible. Close quarters combat, building by building. And what soldiers began finding in some of the houses they entered is just beyond description. They called them, quote, atrocity sites. What they saw inside were the things that the men couldn't describe, and that would appear in their nightmares for years to come. I can neither say nor show you that here, and I know it sucks and that you guys hate it when we have to censor some things, but it is what it is, and I don't like it either. But what I can tell you is that they found cages, chains, bloody handprints, fingernails, knives, an altar with a Quran and a camera tripod, along with DVD recordings that no sane person would ever want to see. And they also found people, some alive, some not. But the signs of what had happened to them were still in those rooms. After seeing this, all soldiers entering Fallujah agreed on one thing: they were not going to fall into the enemy's hands alive. They'd save the last bullet or grenade for themselves, and some units even made pacts among themselves not to let anyone be captured alive, if you know what I mean. After November 15 and 16, when American officials announced the major fighting was over and they were now mopping up, the battle was far from over. It just changed shape. Most of Zarqawi's leadership had already slipped out of the city before the assault, and what remained inside Fallujah were the men who had decided to die there. These guys had pulled back into the southern industrial district and reinforced the positions they had spent the previous summer building. However, the American tactics also changed. They slowed down. Instead of clearing buildings room by room, they turned heavily to satchel charges, Bradleys, and M1 Abrams. If a position was confirmed to have insurgents inside, it was safer to flatten it with everything inside than to enter it. But close quarters fighting kept happening in smaller, more concentrated pockets. Numbers vary by source, but somewhere between 95 and 110 American troops died in the battle, and well over a third of them were killed after that official, quote, major combat over announcement. About 600 more American soldiers were wounded. British forces had 4 killed and 10 wounded, while Iraqis officially had 8 killed and 43 wounded. On the other side, insurgent dead are estimated at between 1,200 and 2,000, with around 1,500 more captured. The accepted figure for civilian deaths inside the city is around 800, although this number was reached by counting casualties in just 9 of the 27 neighborhoods of Fallujah. So yeah, God knows how high the real number is. The city itself was wrecked, with 1/5 of the buildings destroyed and others badly damaged. By any normal definition of the word, the city no longer existed. The horror scenes were what remained after the battle, because most of the bodies couldn't be recovered. The Red Cross and its aid convoys weren't allowed into the city by Americans, and the official explanation was that it wasn't needed because Americans had their own supplies for the people, and there weren't many civilians inside anyway, which was obviously false. So the bodies stayed where they fell for weeks. You can just imagine the scenes then, with desert heat and hungry animals inside the city, and you can imagine why the Marines got the order to shoot all the dogs. I don't think I need to go beyond that to ruin your day. During the fighting in Fallujah, a Medal of Honor was earned by Staff Sergeant David Belavia, plus 8 Navy Crosses and dozens of Silver Stars and other awards, so you know what kind of fighting they went through.